It gives me great pleasure to introduce our conference for this year, which we've called Looking for a New England. The sharp-eyed among you will have worked out that there are some Billy Bragg fans in the NLGN office. I'm a big fan of the Bard of Barking, but I haven't always agreed with his politics. Unlike Billy Bragg, we do want to change the world, and we are looking for a New England. And I think we're starting to see, as you've already heard, the outlines of a very different country emerging. On current trends, I think we can expect to see a world which is less authoritarian, less top-down, less fragmented, more local, more collaborative. I think we could expect to see a place where cities raise and spend more of their own money, where counties do the same, where people are much more engaged in the day-to-day business of looking after each other. I think it's a very optimistic vision. I think localism is about finance, it is about structures, but it's about much more than that. It's about a sense of what a country is and can be, what communities are and can be. And because I'm feeling quite utopian at the moment, I thought I'd put up a picture of Blake's Dance of Albion, because it sort of sums up a sense of the hope that I think we've got at the moment about the future of localism. Equally, of course, I could have put up a picture of Blake's Dark Satanic Mills, because the possibilities that this moment is pregnant with are negative as well as positive. We're facing some huge challenges, gigantic cuts, which I think call into question the very existence of some councils. We work with local authorities who are wondering how they're going to afford to clean the streets in 2 years' time. It's a moment where we can reach a breakthrough point of transformation, or we can fall back, I think, into a period of private affluence and public squalor over the next 5 years. The big driver of all of this is what's happening financially. You all know this, and this is just a different way of showing it to you. If the Chancellor has his way, and as far as we know, Labour won't be so different, by 2019 we will be a country that spends something like 35% of GDP on the state. Now that kind of sounds apocalyptic. We've seen the IFS talking about taking spending back to the 1930s. We're not going back to the 1930s. We're a much richer and more resilient country now than we were then. But I wanted to look at what other countries do. Other countries that spend 35% of GDP or less on public services. There are only 3 of them in the OECD, and they are South Korea, they're Australia, and they're Switzerland. So those are our models, guys. And actually, what it showed me when I looked at this shows you the difference between what they spend on different aspects of government activity and what we spend. What it showed me is that we are embarking on a very strange process of fiscal consolidation in this country. If you look at what happens in Australia, Switzerland and Korea, what they basically have done is they've shifted costs and risks around health, education and welfare into the private sector. Australia spends twice as much in the private sector on healthcare as we do. Its private sector pension contributions are much higher. This is a very successful society, but it does it partly by hiding some of the costs of public services in the private sector. We're not going to do that. We're going to cut benefits, but we're going to leave those other big blocks largely untouched. Education and health are going to remain protected, which means we're trying to do a fiscal consolidation by ignoring what every other country in the OECD has done to get to 35%, and instead trying to consolidate in everything else. We're going to cut the bins, we're going to cut social care, and we're going to do that to preserve the things that everyone else has basically reformed and moved into the private sector. It's going to be a very, very odd state that emerges from all of this. And as I've just said, some services are more equal than others. We know that what's going to happen is that education and health are going to be broadly protected. In fact, I would make a pretty substantial bet they're going to get more money over the next 5 years. Everything else is going to get cut very, very substantially. And actually, that's pretty much what the public wants. There is an iron law to what will happen over the next Parliament, and it's grounded in public opinion. The public wants to protect the NHS. 80% of people want to see health protected. They want to protect schools. Nearly 2/3 of them want to protect those. Actually, the next thing on the list is care for the elderly. The problem is a lot of people don't understand that local government delivers that. And if you look at the polling time and again, the reason that satisfaction with local government remains so high is because they don't actually notice a lot of the areas that you're cutting, because most people don't use social care. So there is an iron logic to what's going to happen over the next few years, and that iron logic says that local government is going to take the brunt of a lot of this. At least at the local level, we are entering a point where we're passing what I've called peak state on this. Peak state is a bit like peak oil. It is the point at which we pass the maximum level of our ability to extract money and spend it on government in society. That may not be true of government as a whole. Of course, we haven't shrunk the state yet, and there are some big questions about how much we can really manage to do that. But in the local state, we are probably passing the high watermark of local government size financially, certainly if it's the size in terms of its workforce. local government as a big, bulky player in the local economy is on the downswing. That's not necessarily a bad thing. I've talked about Australia. Australia is a country that spends 35% of GDP on public services, and it's not a disastrous society. In fact, it's a very successful one. We're not entering a period of decline necessarily as a society, but we are entering a period of transition. And on here it's called the Valley of Nobody Knows. We're entering this strange period where the old set of understandings that we inherited from 1945 are starting to crumble. We are not going to have the 1945 welfare state in 10 years' time. We're going to have something different. A new set of understandings, a new set of ways of working will have to percolate through society. And we're a pretty well-governed society, fundamentally. We have strong institutions, we have the rule of law. We will be fine, but we are going to have a very difficult few years as we work out how we're going to be fine. I think the thing that I find difficult when I look at what both political parties have offered so far is that the policy offer comes nowhere near the scale of the challenge that local authorities face. We've seen some useful stuff around health and social care integration. We've seen a lot of warm words about city deals, about devolution to cities. Is there, in anything that we have heard so far from the two big parties, a game changer? Is there something which helps me to sleep at night, safe in the knowledge that local government will find its way through to 2020 because the national politicians have got it sorted? No, there isn't. So that's a picture of Wigan pier. So some tentative predictions for what will happen as we move into the election and as we move into the next Parliament. Number one, the most important policies won't be in the manifestos. It's simply too difficult, I think, for the political parties to talk about the scale of the change we're going to have to see in the public sector over the next 5 years. And some of the things they're going to have to do will be very, very unpopular. So the manifestos will not tell you what's going to happen in the next 5 years. They'll give you a few clues, but I think the real challenges will be dealt with as they come up. The second prediction, whoever is in power as Chancellor won't hold their nerve. The sheer scale of the reductions we're going to see, the sheer scale of change and the sheer level of unpopularity that's going to cause, particularly around areas like the NHS and social care, I think will force whoever is in power to find more money from somewhere. So expect some tax rises. I would put a very substantial bet on that happening. That money will probably go to health and social care. The big question is whether it's health or social care which is the primary beneficiary. If you look at the money that Labour's planning to raise from tobacco, from the mansion tax, there is more money for social care in there, but it will be used to pay for home carers in the health service. And if you look, I think, at where Andy Burnham's prejudices lie, I think his view would be that local government has an important role to play in integration, but probably it's the acute sector that has the capacity to make this work. So the fact there is more money for health and social care, I'm not sure means that that money finds its way into local government's coffers. Capital spending is going to become a lot more important. Local government's capital spending overall hasn't fallen very much in the last 5 years. And certainly after the London elections, when I was going around new cabinets talking to them about their plans, we would get 3/4 of the way through the day with them talking about high street regeneration, housing, new leisure centres. And then I'd have to remind them that actually they were going to have to cut social care, and how were they going to cope with that? Politicians will want to talk about capital spend because there'll probably still be quite a lot of it. And certainly if Labour's in power, they've got the ability, because they're not going to try and balance the deficit overall, they've got the ability to raise an awful lot more capital investment to spend. So expect a lot of talk about new buildings and new roads. I think since I wrote this slide, it's almost been superseded because the combined authority will continue its march across the country. We're about to see the first county combined authority emerge. This is a new way of doing business in local government. It's a new tier of governance. It's very, very exciting. And I think we're going to have them everywhere by 2020, and they'll take on a lot more functions. If you look at what Greater Manchester's doing and a few of the other combined authorities, they're moving beyond using them as a platform for economic growth, vital though that is, and starting to see them as a way to redesign public services on a much bigger scale. And I think that's the way of the future. On the downside, what's going to happen to local government? Well, we're probably going to see mergers. I think some councils will have to more or less merge themselves out of existence. I look at particularly small unitaries in places like the Tees Valley, and I ask myself how they're going to survive the next 5 years in their current form. I'm not sure some of them can. We are going to see an increased incidence of low-level crisis. I think across social care, you could argue we're already in a sort of low-level perma-crisis in children's services in large parts of the country. That's going to spread. The question will be whether or not the public can join up the dots. Is the public going to recognise that all this low-level crisis, all these stories they're reading about care homes and kids are part of the same phenomena of a sector that's being pummeled financially? Or will the government be able to pass this off as a disconnected set of local failures? Big question. The health service, ironically, has better politicians a lot of the time at a national level than local government does. It's made a very strong case that it will have a crisis without more money. Local government hasn't made that case yet, and I think we need to. And finally, we're reaching a point where a council is going to go bust, and no one knows what happens then. Because if central government creates a failure regime, it has to accept the possibility that it's cutting too much and that failure will happen. What happens if a council goes bust? I fear we are going to find out. Is there a game changer in all of this? What would a game changer look like? The politicians haven't come up with one yet, but it's pretty clear what one might be like. And I think there are only really three options. One is root and branch reform of the finance system. And I was gobsmacked to see Danny Alexander more or less opening up that possibility yesterday when he said that he was interested in devolving stamp duty. The local government finance system is creaking. Council tax is slowly becoming a nationally set tax. The business rate already is. Eventually, the pain of local government not being able to raise and manage local expenditure is going to become pretty acute for the national politicians. Will we reach a point in the next 5 years where it's less painful to reform this mess of a system than it is to try and carry on living with it and muddling through? The second one is probably transfer of social care to the NHS. That would overnight make local government sustainable. It would also create the weakest tier of local government in the developed world, so I'm not terribly keen on it. The third is to go the other way and talk about the devolution of a substantial new funding block to local government. I guess stamp duty could be one example of that. I'm personally keen on primary care. I think if local government were able to commission primary care, we certainly wouldn't have messes like the GP contract emerging again. Equally, it would provide huge incentives for local government to manage prevention. Because if local government is co-paying for hospital admissions, as local authorities in Denmark do, there would be a gigantic incentive to shift money through to prevention, to create healthier communities, rather than spending huge sums of money on the costs of failure. We spend more on fitting gastric bands than we do on proven programmes that fight obesity. It's absolutely absurd. But it's hard to see how the politics lines up behind all of that. And I think that's the big question. Can we make the politics align behind one of those solutions over the next few years? How would we do that? I don't have an answer to that yet, but that's one of our big projects, I think, at NLGN for the coming year. And I think in all of this, what we've got to remember, and I think actually the Core Cities Charter that they released yesterday to try and engage the public in discussion about localism is a really good start on all of this. The thing we've got to remember is that the thing that makes local government more effective than central government is the fact that it's closer to people. It can convene, it can persuade in a way that the centre simply can't. And I think we've got to remember that that is probably the only thing that makes local government better suited to do a lot of the policy changes we need to see happen. So for me, I think the really big challenge for local authorities is a new relationship with citizens. Not simply in terms of saying, could you please do more to pick up litter or look after parks? I think in a sense that as local government moves into this very strategic realm of fixing broken public service systems like skills, like healthcare, as it moves into the strategic realm of taking a much more, I think, assertive role in shaping the local economy to create the conditions for growth, as it moves into that role, it will inevitably not have the same resources it once had to do things for people, particularly not around places, around litter, around parks. I think we're going to need to see a very different sort of partnership. The term I use a lot is commons. And it's the idea that a place is something that we all use and we all have a responsibility to take care of. I think in the past, if you look at public attitudes, if you look at business attitudes, we've too often let people get away with the idea that a place is something you maintain by writing a cheque for your council tax once a year. Actually, what we need to do is get business to get the community involved in taking on responsibility for parks, for assets, for driving forward the things they care about in their places, for a whole new realm of social action. I'm not sure I'm terribly worried about a smaller state as long as we also have a smaller private sector and a vastly expanded realm of social action. I think that is the big challenge for the next 5 years, and it's one only local government can get right. And if we can do that, we have a chance of doing the dance of Albion, I think, and creating a much more optimistic vision of a future Britain that is less scared, that is less fearful, where people do a lot more to look after each other. That's my vision, that's our vision, that's what we're working on. So I hope you enjoy the day, and I think you're going to hear a lot more about some of these ideas.